Today's webinar is about pre-season management. We're going to focus on planting date, maturity group, and biological seed treatments. And I have four folks I'd like to introduce as we get started. Sean Conley is here from the University of Wisconsin. Michael Plumbley is here from Clemson. Fabiano Collette is from the Ohio State University. And Andre Reese is from the University of Missouri. Again, I'm Emma Matcham. I'm from the University of Florida, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, including the Q&A. Sean, do you want to go ahead and get started? I know you have some slides prepared for us.
You bet. Thanks, Emma. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Conley. I'm the State Soybean Small Grain Specialist here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today what we really want to do is kind of dig into some of the work that we've been doing nationwide, looking at how, as farmers push their planting date, how do we make best management recommendations, BMPs for planting dates, but then also integrate changes in maturity group across the United States. And what we'll see is obviously some very big regional and national differences, and we're kind of want to dive into those today and have an open discussion with the audience. So we started some of this work back in around 2015, where we were able to get funding through the North Central Soybean Research Program and do a pretty extensive survey across the North Central region of the United States. And here you can see we're able to get some survey data from over 6,000 farm fields and over 600,000 acres of data. So we have a really big and rich data set that we're working with. And from this information, we were really able to kind of dive in and try and focus in on what's driving soybean yield. And by that, what I mean here, and it's how you would read this figure, these are some of the key factors on the x-axis in terms of what's a priority that has the strongest relationship with yield. And then the y-axis, we have our feature importance. And as we move further up and to the right, those are more of the key drivers. And as you can see across the North Central region, planting data here, it's identified as sowing data, is a pretty big driver. But then also here we see about halfway down the list, we see soybean maturity group. Now, this is kind of a sub-architect that obviously if you're in North Dakota, you have a different maturity group range than you would have in central Iowa or Ohio for that matter. But again, really helps us kind of fine tune and figure out what the big boxes, if you will, are that help predict soybean yield across the North Central region. And we kind of dig in and we look at some of the information here. We see across much of the North Central region, we see changes and differences across regions, and that makes sense. There's some regional differences based on soil type, productivity, weather conditions, and I'll kind of focus on a couple of these right here. So the first one I really want to focus in on is North Dakota, just because it's an extreme. This would be this 3R section, and this would be most of the state that's covered in this coloration. Shows that roughly past about April 25th, by delaying planting per week, you're losing roughly 2.8 bushels per acre per week by delaying planting on April 25th. Now, if we move down into, say, this 4R region here, we kind of push this back roughly to closer to that April 15th date. And at that point, we're losing roughly 2.1 bushels per acre per week by delaying planting. I think most of us are pretty familiar with what's going on here, is that generally our earlier planting allows us to get to more seeds per unit area. But what it also does is it has a relationship with seed size. And in this figure here on the right-hand side, this is a really good idea of some of the modeling efforts that we've done here in terms of when and where we may or may not see this yield increase from earlier planting. And what we've really been able to decipher, and again, I'll focus in on this North Dakota region here because it's pretty clear and separate from much of the North Central region, is that on average, where we're not seeing a big response from getting yield advantage from earlier planting, it's due to a water deficit or a water balance related issue in the reproductive growth stages. And I think we've all talked about that. We've kind of known that, intuitively and through the physiology work that we've done. So I think what we're really trying to push farmers to understand is, yes, by planting early, you generally have more seeds per unit area. And then to really take advantage of that is we need to be able to get that precipitation or those water impacts into August. And I would even argue, based on the maturity groups we're planting today, into that first 10 days in September, especially when you're going across the I-State. So I think we used to always have that rule of thumb, with corn, it's rain in July. With soybean, it's rain in August, especially in the north central region. I know Michael Plumley will talk a little difference in the south and mid-south. But for us, I think we've actually started stretching into that first 10 days in September to really capture those rainfalls during that seed fill period to increase that seed size. Now, one of the things I think we've really been able to do as a team for Science for Success is make some pretty significant changes to our crop insurance. And what I mean by this is, as a collective team, we've worked with RMA and we've been able to update our RMA replant coverage. For example, in Wisconsin, I'll use that because that's my home state. Prior to 2 years ago, we would have April 25th with the entire state of Wisconsin in terms of when you would get RMA replant coverage for early planting. Now, today in the southern part of Wisconsin, we're back to April 15th. So we basically gained 10 extra days of being able to get replant RMA coverage in the southern part of the state. And if you remember back to an earlier slide, what that really tells us is we're basically getting an extra 1.5 to 3.5 bushels per acre or yield gain, and getting coverage by that by being able to update our RMA replant coverage. So again, I think that's a really exciting thing that we've done as a team. And I know if you move further south, and I'll ask Michael Plumley to kind of talk about what they saw in South Carolina, but some of these states got moved up significantly, like an entire month or 6 weeks ahead. So that's great for farmers as we really try to push this earlier planting date. Now, with this earlier planting day, we get questions related to, well, do we or should we modify our maturity group? And I think one thing that we've seen is inherently we've changed our maturity groups over the last 30 years. When I first came to Wisconsin, roughly 15 years ago, and I looked at our old maturity group map, it said that for optimal yield, we should be planting like a 1.5 in southern Wisconsin. We redid that map about a decade ago, and we've really pushed that out to have that optimal maturity group be somewhere between a 2.5 and a 3.0 maturity group. So I think inherently we've really made some of these changes, and a part of this has to do with we're planting earlier. We have better adapted varieties for being able to take advantage of our longer growing season. So we really wanted to kind of fine tune this. So we worked with some farmers and some checkoff dollars here in Wisconsin, and this is funded by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. That we see our different planting dates here outlined. So we started planted last year on April 12th, and we planted roughly every 2 to 3 weeks, all the way from April 12th all the way to July 20th, which would simulate double crop soybeans, which is generally the time winter wheat comes off. And I think and what we would then do is we had and planted anywhere from like a 0.2 maturity group bean all the way to a 2.9 maturity group bean at each one of these planting dates. And generally, our rule of thumb that we would always say was, basically for every week of delayed planting, you would on the back end, you would say 2 to 3 days of delayed maturity. Okay, that was kind of a rule of thumb. However, that's kind of just more of the expert science in terms of not having data to be able to back that up. So with this work we see here, this picture was taken by a drone on September 14th, and now we go to basically a week later and look how drastically we've changed these plots. So within a week, we've seen some pretty significant changes in terms of driving that maturity, which really allows us then to look at this interaction between maximizing yield based on our planting dates. All right, so this figure is pretty busy here, so I want to take a minute to kind of talk about this. So this is work from our 2022 growing season. We weren't able to get in as early in 2022. So these are our planting dates, which would be May 9th and all the way through this chance we were planting on June 30th. On here, what we would say on this axis, we'd have anywhere from our 0.3 maturity group all the way up to our 2.9 maturity group bean. And this would be the yield across these different maturity groups by planting date interactions. So what we had is a good sense of what we maximizing yield. So on our May 9th planting date, what we saw is we could roughly plant anything from a 2.0 bean all the way up to a 2.9 and yield about 80 bushels. If we go to our May 19th planting date, they kind of stretched out a little bit. So we moved it down to a 1.5 to a 2.9 would yield roughly 70 bushels. We get to June 10th, we're moving it all the way down to a 1.2 maturity group bean. So what this really tells us is, yes, we're seeing that effective planting date, but we're also really seeing an effect that as you delay your planting date, and even within a given early planting date, you have a pretty wide range or window of maturity groups you can plant. All right, so let's go ahead and focus in here on last year's data. This would have been the 2023 growing season. And what we can see here is really we didn't see too big of an interaction between planting on April 12th or the 28th, and even up to May 16th. And so we have a big planting date range. But if we look, we were able to plant anywhere from roughly a 1.2 to a 2.9 and still get 80 bushels per acre. So I think the main driving point we really want to focus in on here is, yes, we want to push early as possible. And secondly, is a maturity group range, is a lot wider than I think farmers believe. So we really want to push farmers to pick those high yielding varieties and get them in as early as possible. And if you're in Wisconsin or part of the I-states and you're really trying to focus in on increasing cover crop acres, obviously you'd want to come in and get a 1.5 maturity bean planted early that would yield the same as a 2.9, and you'd roughly have 7 to 10 days earlier maturity to be able to get that fall growth of a cover crop in. So you're not limiting soybean yield, and you're getting 10 more days of fall growth. And we'll just use cereal rye, for example. We all know what 10 extra days in the fall will do to be able to increase fall growth of cereal rye. And then that would equate into the following spring to help with weed control and being able to go in and get some of the real advantages to planting into a cover crop. So I think some of the take-home messages here in the north is, if we're planting earlier, we generally lean into later maturity group yields, into later maturity groups, and that equals higher yields. Again, but the point is we have a pretty wide window. The biggest point is to select high-yielding varieties across that maturity group range that you have within your given state. And really the big yield decline we saw was roughly after about mid-May. I mean, obviously we see some early ones, and we've shown that with that 1.5 to 2.3 bushels from earlier planting. But when the hammer really drops from for minimizing yield or having a big yield penalty after about mid-May. Okay. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch over to Michael Plumley.
And before you do that, I've got a couple quick announcements. For all the CCAs who have joined us today, we will have a QR code for you to register for your CEUs, and that'll be towards the end of the presentation. If there's anybody who does not use the CCA app and needs to get their credits, Haley Ortmeyer Clark will be taking down your CCA numbers out of the chat, or through email. She'll put the information for that in the webinar chat. If any of you have questions for our panelists today, we'll be taking questions from the audience after Michael shares some information about maturity group and planting date in the Southeast US, and Fabiano shares a little bit of information about biological seed treatments. So that's coming up in about 15 minutes. But go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A feature, and I'll be monitoring that so that we get all of your questions to our speakers. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Michael Plumley.
Thank you, Emma. And like Emma said earlier, my name is Michael Plumley. I'm the corn soybean extension specialist in South Carolina with Clemson University. And kind of what I wanted to do was really kind of piggyback on what Sean kind of talked about with some of the maturity group plant and data interactions that we see in soybean, but more of it geared towards the South. So we don't always see the same things that they see in the North, but I think the overall idea or message that Sean talked about earlier was you're going to see some similarities with us in the South. So Sean's going to kind of drive the slideshow for me. So we'll go on to the next slide. All right, so just kind of like some background or history on the South. I don't know how many people or participants on this webinar today are in the South, but historically in the South as a whole, we've been planting determinate soybean varieties or maturity groups. So where this would be something between a 5 and an 8 traditionally, and we have a really wide planting date window. So, I mean, I think at least for South Carolina, it's not uncommon to hear about soybeans being planted from anywhere from April 15th to July the 4th. Some of this would be, depending on if these are full season beans or double crop scenario. But some of the issues or challenges that we face, at least in the South, is a lot of our soybean acres getting planted are in competition with other high value row crops. So this might be peanuts or cotton or even corn, in the South. So depending on how the planting dates shake out these other commodities, depends on when we're getting our soybeans planted. But again, I think traditionally, or at least, the theory behind our maturity group selection and planting date interaction in the South has been that as we progress through our planting window, we would shift to a later maturity group. Again, trying to delay when we start blooming, make sure we get some vegetative growth on the plant before we get to reproductive growth. And some of the research that we've done over the last several years, we're obviously looking for higher yields, ways that we can make soybeans look a little more profitable in the South. We've often looked at these earlier maturity groups. So with the 4s probably being the main one that we've looked at to get the indeterminacy part of the soybean. And so in the Mid-South, so this would be, the Delta region, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Boot Hill, and Missouri, the system has shifted. And this has probably happened about 20 years ago. They really started adopting these early maturity soybean varieties and maturity groups in the South, which are, again, predominantly the 4s. And what they've done with this system is they've shifted their planting date up, growing the indeterminate soybeans. They're putting them on good land. They're irrigating them, and they have seen an increase in yield in this region. So with that being said, there's been a lot of interest in the Southeast and in other parts of the South to look at these indeterminate group 4 soybeans to see if we can get a little more yield out of our crop here in the South. So you can go to the next slide, Sean. So again, some of the differences we see across the South, obviously irrigation density. Irrigation acres are definitely increasing in the coastal plain where I'm at and throughout Georgia and probably into North Carolina as well. But there are some significant soil texture differences. When you go from the Southeast to the Mid-South, the Delta soils are a lot more productive than what we've got in the coastal plain. And I think that's maybe some of the reason that we're seeing these differences in maturity group success by going to the early group 4s versus some of the non-traditional or the traditional maturity groups that we're planting in the Southeast. But one of our colleagues that's in North Carolina, Rachel Van, she kind of made this comment a few weeks ago to me, and it really kind of stuck. She said, in the North, a lot of times we're chasing yield, but in the South, or at least in the Southeast, we're often mitigating risk. So whether that's with drought, disease, insects, I feel like a lot of our recommendations or decisions are for that. So with that being said, how does maturity group and planting date help us mitigate risk in the South? And do our traditional recommendations of maturity group and planting date still really hold true? One thing that we've seen through a lot of the research, at least in South Carolina, North Carolina, with planting the early group 4s, is we've had some issues with seed quality. We get hurricanes a lot of times in the time of the year that we need to be harvesting these soybeans. So we're desiccating a lot of soybeans so we can harvest them more efficiently, get them out of the field. We've seen where they don't really weather as well as some of the 5s, 6s, and the 7s. And so that's something that we're trying to get a better handle on and combat in these type of situations. So I've done a lot of work looking at maturity group planting date in my state. Rachel Van in North Carolina has done a lot of work as well, and really our 2 data sets complement each other and what we've seen in the Southeast. But the question always arises, we've got such a big planting window. Is earlier always better in the South? Is there a planting date that is too early, or what about too late? How late can I still plant a soybean and make a crop? And then, does maturity group really matter? I think, growing up around soybeans, we would start planting, and after a couple of weeks, we might shift from a 5 to a 6, and then plant a few more weeks and swap to a 7. And that was just kind of the way that a lot of people did it. But should we be worried more about the maturity group, or should we go kind of in the direction of what Sean alluded to and really just pick the best variety suited for our situation and go with that? So I've got a few data slides coming up that will hopefully kind of help illustrate this picture. So Sean, yep. So again, vast differences in our landscape everywhere from the Blacklands of North Carolina, which are very good productive soils, to the coastal plain. We are even experimenting a little bit with double cropping soybeans behind corn. So how does the interaction of maturity group and planting date change? Because if I'm planting soybeans in South Carolina in April, does or does not maturity group matter compared to if I'm planting them in early August behind corn? And so again, that's what we're going to, at least my part of the presentation, is going to focus on a little bit today. So this is a data set that we generated in South Carolina over the last few years. Again, some of this was used to help get some of the RMA planting dates shifted for our crop insurance reasons. But basically what we did was we went out and we planted a group 4, 5, 6, and 7 every month from March through August, knowing that, March might have been a little too early, maybe not. And then we knew that, we didn't have a very good likelihood of making a crop planting them in August. But there was a few things that I wanted to point out in this slide. This particular year was what I would consider a wet year. We had several inches more of rain than the average. All of this was done dry land, which is the majority of what our soybean acres are in the Southeast. Just taking kind of a back seat to irrigated corn or cotton or peanuts. But a few things that I wanted to point out with this that I thought was interesting is that even when we're getting out and planting as early as the end of March, we're seeing a yield decline there, especially compared to our April and May planting dates. So that kind of suggests to me that, maybe there is an opportunity to plant a soybean too early, at least in the South. Early might not always be better for us. Naturally, we're seeing a huge yield reduction where we're planting towards the end of July and into August with that. But I think it was kind of interesting that in our earlier planting months, so the end of April through May, we're not seeing as much of a difference across maturity group selection in terms of yield as you might would have thought. As we move into June, we start to see the 4s and the 5s drop off compared to the 6s and 7s. So that kind of, again, reiterates what we've known is the later we plant, at least in the South, we normally shift to a later maturity group to maintain our yield. And we did see that at least in this data set. But again, I don't see at least where we're picking up a lot of yield planting in March. And then going back to the maturity group 4 topic, I think there's a lot of interest again in that with chasing yield. But in a dryland situation, which this trial or data set is from, we're not seeing where we're picking up a significant yield bump on average just from shifting from maybe a 5, 6 to a maturity group 4. So I think given that we do have some quality issues, there's definitely a trade-off there, and I'm not sure we're getting that return back in yield, at least in the data that we've generated here. So looking at the same trial again, but in another year, a more dry year, you see our yields dropped, maybe 20, 30 bushel on average. I would say these are still very good soybean yields for our state, especially dry land, where we've got more weathered soils. But again, we kind of see this same trend. This April, May planting window appears to be probably where we're going to maximize our yield. And again, it's not with these really early maturity group soybeans. Not to say that they always did worse or significantly less, but again, given the trade-off that we may or may not have with quality, we're just not seeing a huge yield bump. Now I'm going to talk about this in a little bit different situation a little bit later in these high yield environments, but for the majority of our acres in South Carolina where we're dry land, and getting them in, this is what we're seeing on average is that really our 5s and 6s or 7s are just a really good variety is probably going to maximize your yield if we're getting them planted in April through May. So within that trial as well, we also wanted to, quantify plant height, number of nodes, things like that. So we looked at each planting date to say, we had this nice bell-shaped curve on yield data, but what did the plant height data look like too? So the only month that was really significantly taller or produced more nodes was we were planting in May. Our environmental conditions were probably on average just better. We had the plants were able to grow off a little bit. Surprisingly enough, our March planted beans, they all just seemed like they were very short, squatty, leathery leaves. Just never really took off like you would think they would getting them planted that early. So that was interesting. take a step further, another kind of interesting thing that we learned from doing a lot of this maturity group planting date work is that when we look at it by maturity group, our maturity group 4 soybeans are actually a taller plant and produced an additional node on average compared to the 5, 6s, and 7s. So, if we're riding down the field or riding down the road, looking at the soybeans or just taking like a visual look, the 4s might look like they're a bigger, bushier plant, might have more yield potential, etc. But when it came to running the combine through it, we're not really picking up more yield, even though we've got an additional node or even some more plant height. So I think that was kind of interesting, a lesson that we did learn from doing a lot of the work that we have done, at least in our state. So again, I mentioned we have such a very broad window of planting in the South. So how does maturity group and planting date impact yield in these non-traditional systems, or more of like a double cropping system or high yield environment for that matter? So it's very common, I would say, in the Southeast to be rotating or double cropping soybean behind small grain. I think our acres used to be a lot higher in years past, but it's still being done on a wide array of acres in the South. Something that's kind of taken off, at least here in the past few years, has been experimenting with double cropping soybeans behind corn. So in this system, what we're trying to achieve is we're planting corn in March. We're trying to cut it at high moisture, so 20 to 25% to get it out of the field. We're immediately following the combine with a planter, getting soybeans planted with hopes that we can maybe average 25 to 30 bushel. All this is done on irrigated land. It's probably more of our productive land where we're putting corn, we're putting fertilizer out there on the corn. So, but these planting dates are going into July through maybe the first week or two of August. But how does planting date shake out that extreme late in the season? And then again, these high yield environments. So this is looking at some of the first year data we did in this ultra late soybean system where we're double cropping soybeans behind corn. And it's a little bit busy, but what I wanted to basically point out with this, across the top, we've got our actual soybean planting dates. And the way that this trial was set up, we had 2 different corn hybrids that we harvested at 3 different moisture contents. And we did that to give us a real life depiction of what the soybean planting date would be. So our July 25th, July 27th, August 1st planting dates, a lot of these would have been 113-day hybrid where we're harvesting at 25 or 20% moisture content, getting the soybeans planted. Some of these later planting dates would have been where we allowed it to field dry, planted 120-day corn hybrid. It just didn't work out in the system. We didn't have enough growing season left to really make it. In 2022 in the South, we had an early frost. So it hurt our yield a little bit. We estimate 10 to 15% yield loss on this particular year. But a few things, again, that I wanted to point out. We've got some variability in maturity group in terms of yield where we're planting soybeans this late. I will say that, the 4s definitely don't seem to really work in this system. It's just so late. What we were seeing a lot of times was where the 4s were almost coming out of the ground with a bloom automatically initiating. So it was just very short plants. Crop height is a critical component in the system to be able to have good combine efficiency and get them into the header. And so we just probably lost some yield with that. But among the 5, 6s, and 7s, didn't see a whole lot of difference in 2022. But if we shift to 2023, we started to see a little bit more of a trend. So a little back history on this. In 2022, we picked some varieties and maturity groups that we thought were very well. At the end of that year, we were able to kind of sift through some of the varietal data, and we found a group 5 soybean that really was just rank. It had a lot of plant height that seemed like it would be a good fit. And so that's what we incorporated into the trial in 2023. And if you'll notice, even though the yields decline as the planting date progressed, the maturity group 5 bars, the green bar, still yielded higher than some of the other maturity groups within the given planting date. And so I think that goes back to kind of driving home that, in theory, the later the maturity group that we would plant, especially this late, would maybe suggest that we would yield more. But in reality, what we're seeing is that where we can pick the very best variety to fit the system, we're actually making yield. So I think overall for full season beans for us in the South, and even in these ultra late double crop scenarios, maturity group may or may not matter as much as we once thought, but maybe the genetics or the soybean variety is probably more of the critical component. And so I kind of wanted to wrap up sharing a few slides I borrowed from Rachel out of North Carolina, where they've done a really good job looking at these high yield environments. And really what they've done is they've taken several of the yield contest entries from across the state over the last 18 or 20 years, and they've kind of sifted through this data to say, what are some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of a yield predictor? What are some of the production practices that these growers are doing that would increase yield? So if you look at the graph on the left, the orange line would be a trend of North Carolina soybean yield, the green line would be the US, and the blue line would be the soybean yield contest entries. And there's obviously a big difference between the orange and the blue. So what are these guys doing in terms of maturity group, planting date, other production practices that are allowing them to be on this upward trajectory on increasing yield? And so when Rachel's team kind of sifted through this mass data set of all of these soybean yield contest entries, but this is kind of how it shook out. So when we're looking at maturity group, and again, I said this was going to kind of be counterintuitive what I talked about earlier, but the majority or their higher yielding entries were coming from where they were planting a maturity group of less than 4. Not to say that there weren't entries entered that were later than a 4, but they picked up almost 20 bushels going to something that was a maturity group 4 or less. Then when we take it a step further and look at, did they use a foliar fungicide or not? We're obviously picking up yield with that as well in both situations, whether it was a early maturity group or a late. But then when we compound that again with planting date, at least on this higher yielding side with the group 4s, the earlier we planted the soybeans, we're also picking up yield. So out of this kind of decision tree, we're able to, make some pretty good decisions on if we're shooting for high yield, if we're in a high yielding environment. These are some of the factors that we probably need to consider to make sure that we are going to achieve these high yields. And so out of that, you get these strongest predictors of yield being planting date, foliar fungicide use, and maturity group. And within all these strong predictors of yield, there's obviously challenges that are associated with that, especially in the South, where if we're, planting them earlier, we're going to have issues with the timing our harvest, whether it may be hurricane season or coinciding with another crop harvest. What about pest management? How does that impact things? Things like green stem. That's something that is definitely a challenge for us in the South in years. How do our rainfall patterns kind of coincide with planting date as well? I feel like over the last few years, we've kind of gotten these cyclical times of being dry or being wet, at least in our state. And if we can kind of line up our planting dates with that, maybe we could capitalize on some of the moisture on our dry land acres. Again, foliar fungicides. What about the yield environment, resistance management, maturity group? What about rotational complexity? So this would be things like, are we trying to get something in after that? How does the harvest date impacted by the maturity group that we are planting as a function of the planting date that it's falling into? And then again, harvest timing with maturity group 2. I've got some farmers here that even though they probably have the potential to make high soybean yields, they want to plant a late maturity group so that it matures after they're done picking peanuts and picking cotton. So again, all these things kind of have to work together. But again, these are 3 of the things that really stuck out in terms of a strong predictor for yield. And so kind of a conclusion for what we're seeing in the South, at least, is March planted soybean might be a little bit too early to maximize yield. Again, we have this very large planting window. We're not as extreme in the north as trying to capture as much sunlight and heat as we can to kind of develop the crop. We have a lot different geography. We have smaller field size, a lot more edges. We have significant wildlife issues, especially in my state. If we're the first one to jump out there and start planting a soybean, we might be the first green thing with tender foliage for deer to feed on. So that's something to think about if we're in the South. But again, April through May appears to be kind of our optimum planting window. And again, maturity group selection may not be as big of a driving factor in yield as maybe it once was thought. Not to say that we need to totally ignore it, but I think variety selection and planting a proven variety that you know will fit well in your production system and yield is probably the more critical component with that. But again, in high yield environments, a lot of this is going to change. Most of the data I showed, at least from the full season aspect, is going to be in a dry land environment. If we start to add in irrigation or we've got really productive soils, we do see a yield benefit from an earlier maturity group, but still, again, maybe not necessarily the earliest planting date. So those are definitely some differences, I would say, from the south to the north. But overall, I think we're seeing some of those similar trends with the maturity group selection and that sort of thing.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fabiano Colette. I'm a PhD student at The Ohio State University, and today I'll be presenting very briefly about one of my projects, PhD projects, that's on biological seed treatments. So the biological market is growing, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And here in the United States, we can find a lot of companies out there selling biological products. And this figure here is showing an extensive list of companies that are present here in the United States that are selling those biological products. And these biological products are classified into many different types. For example, biofertilizer, inoculants, biopesticides, and others. Next slide, please. So, and some of these products, they claim that they help plants by helping plants to fix more nitrogen, help plants to fix phosphorus or fix another nutrients, also stimulating root growth, expanding root absorption, and also they claim that they control diseases and nematodes. So with that, we had this research that had the objective to evaluate if biological seed treatments improve soybean yield across the US. And we conducted this research over 2 years, in 2022 and 2023. In 2022, the research was conducted in a small plot in 49 locations in the United States across 17 states, here represented in this picture in red coloration. The experiment design was a randomized complete block design, and we use biologic products. They were applied to the seeds that were already applied with fungicide and insecticides with chemicals to represent what usually farms do in the United States. And we use label instructions regarding what is the rate for each product, what is the application window, or what's the storage recommendations for each product. So for 2022, we had 8 treatments. Treatments 1 through 7 were different products. And those products sometimes contain multiple, a combination of microorganisms, or sometimes there were only one species of microorganisms there. And these microorganisms are known for example, treatment number 7, Glomus, is a mycorrhizal fungi that helps plants to uptake phosphorus. Trichoderma help plants to grow and also suppress some diseases. Bradyrhizombium, which is number 3, is known for helping plants to fix nitrogen. And the treatment number 8 was the untreated control. So those seeds were only treated with, were bought that were already treated with fungicide and insecticide only. They were not treated with the biologicals. So moving on to results for 2022. In the table on your left, you can see the treatment list there again. And on the graph that's showing on your right, we can see the data distribution by treatment that was in 2022. On the y-axis, we have the grain yield in bushels per acre, while on the x-axis, we have each treatment. Here, this graph is showing the national results for this project, so the national average for each product. In this case here, the treatment number 8, which is our control, yielded 63.7, while the other treatments, the products, they yield a little bit below, between 62.8 and 63.5. So when we analyze that yield difference between each treatment versus the untreated control, we didn't find any significant result by analyzing using single degree of freedoms. So even though there were some negative yield penalties by applying microorganisms, that was not a significant result. Next slide. So moving on to treatment moving on to the next year that this research happened, which was in 2023, last year. Last year we had similar project, but we had more locations. We have 52 locations across 20 states in the United States. We use the same protocol, and we also use the same label instructions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. However, some of the treatments change, some of the products change, and we also added 2 extra products in this list. So treatments number 1 through 9, we had products that are commercially available in the United States, and treatment number 10 was our untreated control. So for 2023, this graph here is also showing the data distribution by treatment. In the y-axis, we have the grain yield in bushels per acre. In this case here, last year, the treatment control nationally averaged 64.1, while the treatments from treatment 1 through 9, the average was between 64 through 65.8 bushels per acre. Next slide, please. And the yield difference, when analyzed that yield difference between each treatment minus the untreated control, we found statistically significant results when the bradyrhizobium was applied, when treatment 3 was applied, which increased the soybean yield in average 1.6 bushels per acre. So in conclusion, for this project, we need to take in consideration that for this symbiotic relationship, we need to have the plant host there, which in this case, we have soybeans. We need to have the plant beneficial microbes, which in many cases, most of the cases, we are finding these microbes already present in the soil, but in this case, we are also applying those microbes into the seeds before planting. But we also need to have a conducive environment. So these microbes, they are very sensible, and they need the right environment. They need the right pH, they need the right temperature, the right moisture, to be able to have this symbiotic relationship with plants. So my recommendations here is, if you plan to buy and use biological products for soybean seed treatments, please read and follow all the product labels. Also, my recommendation is first try that product on a small field on your area. So there is online, there is some sources that you can find how is the best way to have this experimental design on your farm. From the products that we tested in this research, the retail product cost ranges from 3 to 5 bushels per acre. But also other data was collected and will be incorporated into the data set for analysis later. So we had soil sample, grain samples, we collected foliar tissue samples, we know the field crop history. All those information we will use the information to analyze further if there is any specific environment condition, any specific management practice that help to conduct to have a better soybean yield response to the biological seed treatment. Also, what I present here today was a national average. However, if you are interested to know the results from your specific state, please feel free to reach me out or any member of the Science for Success.
Thank you all for your presentations. That was really interesting. Fabiano, is it okay if we drop your email address in the chat so that if people have questions about their individual states, they can reach out?
Of course, yeah, please.
Oh, awesome. Can you go ahead and type that, or do you need me to?
I can type on the chat. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. With that, I'm going to go ahead and end our last poll question so that we can look at these results here about biological seed treatment adoption among our participants. So, and Haley, thank you for putting the poll question up. Looks like around half of you have used inoculants or other biological products as part of your seed treatments before. So thank you for sharing. We have one question in the chat so far, and this is from Keith Dunn. In Southeast Virginia, we have seen big yield increases by planting group 4 to 4.5 maturity group beans around April 15th through the 20th. And the only downside is the damage we see if there's any adverse weather near harvest time. And he's asking about ways to mitigate that. So I'm going to pass this question to Michael Plumbley first, and then over to Andre second. Participants, feel free to put more questions there in the chat. In the Q&A box. The Q&A box is how we will be getting all of your questions to our panelists today. Thank you all for being here. Michael?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's probably the most common question, at least in our region with the earlier maturing group 4s and that sort of thing, is obviously the damage. Surprisingly, even last year in some of our trials where we were looking at ways to try to mitigate it, and we had a pretty dry fall, we were still running damage in excess of 10% in plots, and we didn't have a hurricane, we didn't have a lot of rainy weather. But I will speak to probably harvest efficiency is going to be one of the main things, trying to get them out. I know a lot of my growers are only planting enough group 4s that they can get them sprayed and harvested in 2 days if they needed to. So they're trying to mitigate risk that way. We've talked about this several times with different people, kind of theorizing on why we're seeing issues with quality in these soybeans. And I don't know if the group 4s just don't handle stress as well as some of the later maturity groups traditionally do. But there's definitely some kind of environmental interaction going on with that. With that being said, we did do some work over the last year, at least trying to debunk or see, could we spray our way out of an issue with quality on those type of soybeans. So what we did here, knowing that it probably wouldn't be economical or even maybe not even within labeled rates, but we wanted to look to see, could we spray foliar fungicides at certain timings or in combination to try to preserve any of the seed quality that we've got going on. And so what we did in South Carolina is we sprayed soybeans starting at R1, R3, and R5, and then we did all the different combinations with a 2 mode of action fungicide product. Again, this was probably in the absence of any disease, but what we saw at the end of the year, and again in a dry year, is regardless if we even sprayed a fungicide, we didn't preserve any of the quality. So I just wanted to put that in, that at least in our data set, we have not seen where we can apply a product at a certain timing or sequential products to try to preserve some of the seed quality things going on there. But I don't know if anybody else, Sean or Andre, if y'all have got any other suggestions on how we could mitigate some of the issues we're seeing in the South with seed quality on the maturity group 4s.
Michael, this is Andre. I guess you covered pretty much everything. I would say the challenge of finding the optimal combination between maturity group and the planting date is, when we think about yield, we want to put the seed filling, which is one of the main phenological stages correlated with high yield, in the best environmental conditions as far as water availability and radiation, right? But also we have to consider the conditions after that during the harvest. So in Louisiana it was super common to have heavy rainfall after seed filling during late R6, R7, and R8, and that would damage the seed, even though the grower was able to secure a high yield potential during seed feeding, but having non-ideal conditions by the time the crop was senescing. So when we do the combination, or when we try to optimize the combination between planting date and maturity group, it's important not also to try to put the seed filling in the optimum weather condition, but also the maturation period under a predictable or expectable ideal condition to mature in order to have not only high yield potential, but also seed quality.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I'm gonna ask one more question from the chat about maturity group before we move on to a couple other topics. Troy's asking, do you like indeterminate group 5 better than group 4? And I'm gonna assume this is also for the Southeast.
Personally, yes. The indeterminate fives that I have grown seem to weather much better. And I've even grown some of those that I've not desiccated and haven't seen a huge uptick in seed quality issues like I have with the fours, but that's just my personal experience, I guess, with an indeterminate five.
Yeah, I've actually had really good luck with them in North Florida as well. I haven't grown a whole lot of group 4s here, but the indeterminate 5s have weathered pretty well and had better seed size than some of the other things we were growing. Thanks for the question, Troy. I have a question here from Alton. Knowing that fruiting structures develop at nodes, is anyone working on how to stimulate additional nodes on the plant? I'm going to pass this to Sean first because I think he's worked a little bit on this.
Sure. So the easiest thing that we've really seen is earlier planting stimulates nodes. I've sprayed a lot of different products, and I haven't really seen a consistent yield of extra nodes just through trying to spray your way into more nodes. What we've generally seen is our earlier planting is the biggest, at least in the north, driver of node number. And I think one of the things sometimes we get lost with is you may plant a little bit later and the beans seem taller, but that's because we have these really long internodes. Whereas when you're planting earlier, generally, I don't want to say generally, but often, I guess it's the same thing as generally, is that we tend to see the beans a little bit shorter, but we have the stacked internodes are shorter, and we see more nodes. So again, in the north, that's generally why we see higher yields. Earlier planting equals more nodes per plant, more nodes per plant equals more seeds per unit area. Michael, Andre, what are y'all seeing in the South and Mid-South?
Yeah, at least in our data that I shared in the talk earlier, we're not seeing where the earliest planting we're stacking more nodes in, but kind of in this optimum planting window. But that's kind of where I'm at too, is if we can get them planted in this optimum window, which typically middle to end of April or beginning first week or so of May is where we're maximizing that here.
Yes, I agree. And I don't know if the question was also referring to other methods for increasing node number as hormone application. I would say most likely the best way to modulate the nodes number is to play with maturity group and planting date. And I have tested before a few hormonal products to node regulation, and the results are pretty erratic. The best way to correlate the nodes and yield is to play with maturity group and planting dates.
Now, has anybody else on this call used rolling or seeding rate to attempt to increase node count? No. I did a little bit with it when I was in Ohio. This would have been 5 or 6 years ago. We did see that increasing seeding rate or rolling beans increased nodes, but that didn't necessarily correlate to an increase in yield, especially if you don't end up having enough rainfall late in the season.
Yeah, I would say that in our trials with plant population, we have seen more internode length changing with plant population even more than node number. Although node number could be also changed with population, but the impact on yield is again not super robust.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Also, I
go
will
ahead.
just add that during my master, I also had our research on planting date and seeding rate here in Ohio. And we also saw that there was an increase of a number of nodes, but that by planting date, by seeding rate, but that did not affect yield. What in the end affected the yield the most was the planting date, early mature, early planted soybeans, but also the environmental conditions, especially at R2, R3, R4, and R5 growth stages.
Awesome, thank you. Sean, can you go ahead and advance the slides so that our CCAs can get their QR code? Awesome, thank you. CCAs, if you do not use the app to track your CEUs, Haley Ortmeyer Clark's email address is in the chat, and you can email her your CCA number and your full name so that she can register you for the CEUs as well. But the best way to get the credit is to use the app and the QR code that's on the slide. I've got a question here from Jeff for our panelists. When comparing planting dates, how did tillage practices affect yield, specifically no-till versus conventional? And Sean, I think you have some data on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So one of the things that we've seen specifically, I'll just speak to Wisconsin data because that's where we have the most of this, is we have seen, I want to call it maybe a yield difference between no-till and tilled soybeans historically. I mean, obviously this last year where we didn't have rain for 60 days, our no-till beans generally performed better. We had those soil moisture savings. But one of the challenges we see specifically over the last 10 years, I would say, and I'm just going to throw this number out there because I'm not 100% sure it's accurate, but it's corn agronomy. And I don't listen to corn agronomists that much because they're boring. But I would say probably 7 out of the last 10 years, we've seen record corn production in the state of Wisconsin. We have record corn production. We're going to have a record residue development out there as well. And sometimes we're really pushing these high corn yields. It's a challenge to get soybeans planted or established no-till. So a couple of things we've really moved into. So we don't see a difference between strip till soybeans and conventional soybeans. So if farmers are really looking at that interplay, I really think strip till is a place to be able to go in and save at least 63% of the residue out there by just making those strips. I understand it's a large cash investment to be able to, you usually have to buy a new tractor with a high horsepower, and the equipment cost and outlay is pretty significant in those systems, but we've really seen that help. And this last year, not that I want to really heavily promote this, but we've got 2 years of data in a row where we've seen just a little bit of nitrogen at planting in a no-till soybean system, less than that 30-pound range, has really allowed that early season growth on soybeans to kind of overcome some of that initial yield penalty we're seeing in these heavy no-till situations. And we've seen our yields the same in no-till soybeans with a little bit of spring nitrogen out there below that 30-pound rate that would equal our conventional beans. So again, not that I want to promote a ton of nitrogen applications out there no-till, but I'd rather have a little bit nitrogen in the spring than going out there and tilling up a bunch of soil, and that leads to other water quality, carbon loss type of an issue. So I think that's something that we're still playing with to really, drive that soybean yield and mitigate some of that early season yield loss just based on residue management out there.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. Before we answer this last question, I'm going to go ahead and thank folks just because we're at the end of our formal time today. First off, thank you to all the attendees who were able to make it today. We really appreciate you coming and asking great questions. Thank you to our speakers. the United Soybean Board for funding Science for Success, the state soybean boards that supported the research that we discussed today, Rachel Van at North Carolina State University for her leadership of the Science for Success team, Haley Ortmeyer Clark for being the program manager and helping set up all of the tech behind the scenes for this, and for Christian, who helped do the advertising and shared this registration information with you all. With that, if we have time, I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question to our panelists. In the north, early planting normally causes an increase in the number of days to emergence. Do you think that there are significant risks of trying to reduce days to emergence, especially with freezing or cold injury? Some type of seed priming or speed emergence sounds interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and thanks for the question. So actually, I think what farmers are actually doing up here is they're using delayed emergence to their advantage. So they're actually banking on delayed emergence to get them past that point where we would have elevated risk for frost damage. So I know we have a farmer here in the state that likes to go out there and plant beans early, and he's going to he put a few acres in last week. I think the last week of March, he's just going to hammer. And he's like just hoping it doesn't come up before, the last week in April. So he's banking on delayed emergence. So that's kind of one of the things that we see, because roughly that risk of frost injury after May 1 is really, really low. Obviously, we have weather variation, and that plays a big role in this. But if we keep our beans underground, at least to that last week in April, that risk for frost injury is pretty low for most farmers in Wisconsin.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. I do want to point out that Michael Plumley answered quite a few questions in the Q&A typed answers as well. So if you're interested, go look at that. This was the first of our winter webinar series for Science for Success. We have 2 more coming up next week on Friday at the same time. We'll have in-season fertilizer and fungicide applications. And then on March 22nd, we have late season desiccation decisions. For those of you with questions about harvest quality, this is going to be a great webinar for you all. So again, we have more webinars on March 15th and March 22nd. You can register at the link on the slide or using the QR code. Thank you all for attending today, and we are Science for Success.